Hello and welcome to the Level Up Video Game Parent Guide. Today for our third topic, we're going to be talking about video game violence. Now, many of today's popular video games have some degree of violence within the game. I would say that it's very important to keep context in mind when we're talking about video game violence. For example, if your child is playing a game like Lego Star Wars and they're punching the bad guys or hitting them with a lightsaber and they turn into a bunch of Legos, that's one kind of violence. Not so bad, right? But there are other video games where the player will take the role of a character that's much more violent than that. For example, in some games, you'll take the role of a violent serial killer and your objective is to murder the other players within the game. Once again, we'll have to take the player's age into consideration when we're talking about appropriateness of a video game, when we're talking about violence. Speaking of context, it's also important to understand why your child is playing a particular game. For example, in the very popular game Fortnite, players go around a map shooting each other with realistic light guns. Most likely your child will say that the reason they play that game is so they can beat their friends and other people online, rather than to learn about the intricacies of a certain type of gun, for example. However, some of the mature rated games have a lot of detail that they go into with certain types of guns, so all the more reason to follow the ESRB guidelines, right? When your child shifts to playing online, there are other things to consider. When your child is playing a game that's primarily meant for adults, they're most likely going to be playing the game with adults. As a parent, you're going to have to come to a decision if that's okay with you. Again, I will stress that keeping age appropriateness in mind is very important for video game violence. Not all violence is made the same. And speaking of video game violence, scientists still debate whether or not video games contribute to someone actually being violent. So that's a topic outside of this discussion, but maybe in the future I'll make that video. Keep in mind that if you restrict violence too much, for example, if you have a teenager and you're not allowing them to play games that are rated E10+, then you're restricting entire genres of video games and potentially stifling your child from games that they could be playing with their friends. When making a decision about video game violence, it's important to keep your child's age, their developmental level, and your own household values in mind when you're making this decision. Briefly, I want to give a few examples of some video game genres and how the level of violence can shift from the different ratings. So let's talk about first or third person shooter games, for example. For a low violence example, I'll use the game Plants vs. Zombies. So this is cartoon violence where a plant and a zombie go around shooting each other with cartoony light guns, not realistic guns. Or in the plant's case, they're actually shooting out of their mouth. This would be in the cartoon violence category. Your child will be more entertained by the ridiculousness of it. An example of a medium type of violence game would be the very popular Fortnite game, where players run around a map with guns, trying to take one another out as the map gets smaller and smaller. The guns may look real, but when a player defeats another player, there's no gore or blood associated with that. Examples for more high violence type of games would be games such as the Call of Duty series or the Battlefield series, where players are opposing military forces and the objective is to kill the other players. The players are using realistic guns and there is blood involved. Finally, we have games in the what I like to call the ultra-violent category, where the level of gore and the level of blood steps up higher than what would be realistic. Games such as Gears of War, for example. Now, I'm not knocking any of these games. I think they're great for adults, but for children, they can be very inappropriate. Next, let's look at the open world genre. For a low violence type of game, let's look at the very popular game Minecraft. So Minecraft, players can defeat each other with blocky looking swords and there's not any blood or gore involved. It's very cartoony. An example of a medium type of violence game would be games like in the superhero genre, such as Spider-Man. So Spider-Man beats up bad guys and defeats them. He's using realistic types of attacks like kicks and punches, and but there's not any blood involved. A high violence game would be a game such as The Witcher 3, which you use swords to defeat monsters and can be very graphically violent at some times. A game that would also be of high violence or sometimes even ultra violence would be a game such as Grand Theft Auto 5, where you're not just shooting people in a realistic manner, but you're also committing a litany of crimes. So if that's not your cup of tea for your child, I would recommend against that game. As always, I would definitely have this discussion about violence with your child. I would recommend discussing the difference between fantasy cartoon violence versus realistic violence, and if they have any questions about that they can come and talk to you. In the world that we live in now, most likely your child has been exposed to violence through images over social media or over the news, and unfortunately that level of violence may exceed that of an age-appropriate video game for them. So it's important to have these discussions about violence, not just in the scope of video games, but also the rest of the world. A lot of times this can be very confusing for your child, and you as their parent can be a valuable source of information for them when they have questions about that. So here are some questions you should ask yourself or your child. Does your child play the game for the act of violence, or are they playing simply to beat their friends and have a good time? Does your child tend to play repetitively violent games? Does your child lead the violence in the video game world, or are they the type of child that brings that out and enacts it in their real life? That could be a problem. And going back to the last video, does your child have any games that are outside of their age limit, such as mature level games or teenage games if they're under the age of 13? Stay tuned for next week's video. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, make sure you do so right now. And make sure that you're watching in the playlist so you don't miss any of the videos. This is Dr. Mike. I'll see you in the next video.